The Dragonback series by Timothy Zahn. Book 5. Dragon and Judge. Chapter 29.
The search for the two humans lasted most of the night, with Golvins and lights moving erratically across the canyon floor. By morning, though, the searchers seemed to have given up and gone back to their normal daily lives. Which wasn't to say there was no danger. For over an hour around sunrise that first morning, Jack huddled in the back of the apartment with Langston, hardly daring to breathe as the Golvins with apartments above theirs climbed down the pillar's ivy coating on their way to their fields and other jobs. Fortunately, Langston had lived there long enough to have left plenty of residual scent behind. Apparently, it was enough to mask the fresher scents of the fugitives. Later that evening, for the same hour, Jack and Langston again had to retreat to the rear of the apartment as the Golvins reversed direction and headed back home. The next 3 days passed slowly. Though the morning and evening rush hours were the most dangerous, a scattering of Golvins moved up or down at other times during the day, making casual conversation dangerous. Besides which, after the first day of the limited food rationing Langston worked out, Jack's stomach was rumbling so loudly and so constantly that it was a wonder none of the passing Golvins heard it. But of more concern to Jack than his stomach, or even his safety, was Dracos. His biggest fear on that long first night was that the Kada would be so deeply unconscious that he wouldn't be able to return to Jack's skin when it became necessary. Jack and Langston had solved that problem by having Jack strip off his clothing and stretch out on the cold stone floor with Dracos lying full length on top of him. As the time limit approached, the Kada simply melted back onto Jack's skin. But as Langston had predicted, the bandage came off when Dracos went two-dimensional. Every time after that, whenever he came off of Jack's skin, they found that a little more fresh blood had oozed from the wound. And while the Kada soon came back to a sort of dreamy consciousness, he remained weak and unable to do much except eat and sleep.
I just hope he didn't take any damage he can't heal by himself, Langston commented mid-morning on the third day as he carefully wiped off the latest bit of blood. If your numbers are right, the rest of his people are still over a month away.
He's gonna get well, Jack growled. He is.
I know, Langston said quickly. I'm just saying, that's all.
But he was right, Jack knew, as he gazed down at his sleeping friend. Dracos was recovering, but slowly. Much more slowly than he'd bounced back from other injuries. He needed medical attention and medical treatment. And he wasn't going to get either trapped in the Golvin Canyon. You're right, Jack said with a sigh. We need to get him out of here. He looked up at Langston. Tonight.
Let's not go off half-charged, Langston warned. If he's got internal injuries or bleeding, it might actually be more dangerous to move him than to let him just lie here quietly and heal.
And starve to death? Jack countered. Langston grimaced.
Point, he conceded. Okay, compromise. At current rations, we've got about 3 days left. Let's give him one more day of rest and heal. Tomorrow night, win, lose, or draw, you and I will sneak down the rabbit hole and see about grabbing that air car.
Deal, Jack said with a twinge of dread. If they moved Dracos too soon, or moved him too late, they could end up killing him. He was just wondering if he should suggest they wait 2 days instead of one when he heard the sound of a distant explosion. Dracos' eyes came halfway open. Jack! He murmured. I know, Jack said, getting to his feet and heading to the door. One look at the rising pillar of smoke and sand above the eastern canyon rim was all he needed. I don't believe it, he said. They blew up the mine.
Someone did, Langston said grimly from beside him. But it wasn't the Golvins. You hear that?
Jack strained his ears. No.
I do, Langston said. It's the lifter subthrob of a Gin 90 pursuit fighter.
Jack felt his heart seize up. Oh, no, he breathed.
Yeah, Langston said. Offhand, I'm guessing your Malison ring buddies have tracked you down.
And right on cue, 3 large starfighters shot into view over the canyon rim.
That tears it, Langston bit out, stepping back from the door. Come on.
Where are we going? Jack asked, following him to where Dracos lay.
Into the rabbit hole,
Langston said, scooping the rest of their food back together into Jack's Judge Paladin hat.
They'll be firing up their sensors any minute now, looking for human heat signatures. Inside a pile of stone is our best bet.
We're already in one, Jack objected. His muscles still ached from his earlier climb up the light shaft, and he wasn't at all sure he could handle a repeat performance. Besides, those Gen 90s are way too big to get down here. His last word was punctuated by the rippling crack of laser fire. There was a second salvo, and the air was suddenly shattered by the sound of crumbling stone.
Not for long,
Langston said grimly, stuffing the hat into his jumpsuit.
Now was one of the stabilizing arches getting blown to gravel. A couple more of those, plus a few guy wires, and they'll be able to bring in any ship they want.
Jack swallowed hard. And when that happened, he and Dracos would be caught like trapped mice. You've sold me, he said, getting a grip on Dracos' paw. Let's get that air car and get out of here.
No!
Dracos said. It's the only way, Jack told him. Come on, get aboard.
We don't go down,
Dracos insisted, his voice strained.
We go up!
Jack looked at Langston, saw his same puzzlement mirrored there. Dracos, Frost and his men are up there, he explained, searching Dracos' face for signs of fever or delirium. If the Kada was starting to drift off on them.
But soon they will be down here,
Dracos said.
Wing Sergeant Langston is correct. Once they have a path through the obstructions, all their ships will come down to join in the search. We can then cross the guy wires and arches to the edge of the canyon.
Great, except that's all desert out there, Langston said in a tone of strained patience.
There's nowhere to hide.
Not even in the mine, Jack added. They blew up the entrance.
I know,
Dracos said.
But we can hide in the sergeant's wrecked starfighter.
Jack opened his mouth, closed it again. Can we? He asked, looking at Langston.
I think maybe we can,
Langston said, his forehead wrinkled in thought, a cautious excitement starting to creep into his voice.
I'll be blasted. The hatch should be. Yes, a little digging and we can. And the whole thing's pretty well sensor shielded. They'd have to specifically target us to pick us up.
Assuming we can get to it, Jack warned, but at least we've got a plan. Come on, Dracos. This time the Kada obeyed. A minute later, Jack and Langston were once again in the light shaft and once again starting to climb. As all around them came the echoing sounds of destruction. The sky had begun to go dark, and Allison was settling in for her fourth night in the isolation hut when she heard the sounds of distant gunfire.
What's that?
Taneem asked, her ears stiffening. Sounds like Stronglow and his friends got tired of waiting, Allison said grimly as she pulled on her shoes. Great.
What are we going to do?
Taneem asked anxiously. Try first to figure out what's happening, Allison said, cautiously pushing open the door. No one was visible among the deepening shadows. After that, I don't have a clue. She held out her hand. Come on. She'd made it no more than 50 yards when Taneem whispered a warning in her ear. Allison dodged sideways behind a tree and was pressed against it when a female Parapin shot past, heading for the hut. Looking for me? Allison called softly. The Parapin jerked to a halt.
They have come,
she gasped, hurrying back to Allison.
The Bremgas have entered the compound with weapons and restraints.
Another burst of gunfire echoed in the distance, and Allison winced in sympathetic pain. So the spies figured it out.
The penitent has had no choice but to lead us to the attack,
the Parapin said.
He asks for your aid.
And Taneem, Allison suspected, was more than ready to render that aid, and possibly get herself killed in the process. The question was how much Allison herself was willing to do for this lost cause.
Allison Kana?
The Parapin prompted as she hesitated. Allison came to a decision. Go back to the penitent, she ordered the Parapin. Tell him we'll do what we can. For a moment, the alien searched Allison's face, as if not sure whether to believe her. Then, with a curt nod, she took off again through the forest.
We are going to fight?
Taneem asked, her voice wary. Do you want to? Allison countered. We don't have to, you know. This isn't our war.
It was our arrival that created this danger,
Taneem said.
We can't simply turn our backs on them.
Even if it means Dracos' people, your people, will die? Tanim seemed to brace herself.
The Kada warrior ethic requires that we do what is right,
she said quietly, the words almost swallowed up by another burst of distant gunfire.
no matter what the advantage or cost to ourselves.
Allison grimaced. She'd called it all right. Death and glory and honor and pride. Dracos had indoctrinated the young Kada, but good. Lucky for us, we're not Kada warriors, she reminded Tanim. Putting the sound of gunfire to her left, she headed off southward through the forest. Tanim's head rose from her shoulder.
Then we are going to abandon them?
Well, we're certainly not going to charge straight into the Brumga's guns, Allison said. If we're going to do anything, we're going to try to be clever about it.
Then you do have a plan.
I said if we do something, Allison cautioned. Let's first figure out the lay of the land.
But the fire is coming from the slave compound,
Tanim said, flicking her tongue past Allison's chin toward her left. One more good reason not to go there, Allison said. But mostly we're not going there because that's not where the Brumgas have their main attack line, Allison interrupted her. The ones making all the noise in the compound are just there for show. Their job is to drive any potential rebels or escapees through gaps in the hedge into the real trap.
Which is where we are going.
Which is what we're going to take a look at anyway, Allison said. Here we are. Everybody off. Ahead, the hedge loomed over them, 10 feet of densely tangled branches and long thorns.
You wish to go over it?
Tanim asked doubtfully as she leaped off Allison's skin. Not over, Allison corrected her. Through. Get those Kada claws working. Tanim gave a little hiss of malicious satisfaction. Lifting her forepaws and extending her claws, she set to work. 2 minutes later, she'd carved out a hole big enough to slide through. Great, Allison said. Now we're going to head southeast, quietly, towards where the Brumga should have set up their lines. Tanim nodded and headed off at a brisk trot, her ears cocked, her tongue flicking out with every other step. Trying to suppress her own misgivings, Allison followed. They didn't have far to go. Flickers of laser fire were coming from a line of bushes and small fountains scattered around the north end of the slave owner's section of the grounds. The nearest firing position was no more than 30 yards away, with the entire combat line stretched across nearly 400 yards. In the dim light, Allison could make out the hulking forms of some of the nearer Brumgas hunched over their weapons. They weren't firing at random either. To the north, at the base of the hedge, Allison could see the shadowy figures of Stronlow's would-be escapees. Some were still coming, zigzagging in an effort not to be shot, but most were flat on their faces, pressed helplessly against the grass. From the slave compound behind them, in mocking counterpoint to the silent lasers, came more loud volleys of gunfire. Allison felt her throat tighten, a sinking feeling in the pit of her stomach. So the trick had worked. The roving Brumgas in the compound had forced Stronlow's slaves to make their move, and now they were trapped. With a sigh, she trotted to a halt. So that's it, she murmured. I'm sorry, Tanim. But Tanim hadn't stopped. In fact, she'd picked up speed. Tanim! Allison snapped. Come back! The Kada ignored her. To Allison's horrified disbelief, she gave a shrill, warbling scream and aimed herself at the nearest Brumgan firing post. And charged. Jack had made it perhaps 50 feet up the light shaft when he heard the sound of rapid footsteps far below. Langston? Langston?
Quiet,
The other whispered urgently. But it was too late. Even as Jack craned his neck to look, he saw the outline of a Golvan head appear in the opening in his former apartment fall below. The Golvans had found them. And with that, Jack knew with a wave of utter weariness, it was all over. The Golvan would run and tell the One, and the One would tell Frostman, and they would come and get him. They would possibly kill Jack. They would certainly kill Dracos.
Port side, near the nose, Langston murmured. Hatch opens outward.
Jack frowned as he blinked back sudden tears.
What? The hatch,
Langston said. His hand appeared from below, dropping the Judge Paladin hat and food onto Jack's chest.
Good luck.
And before Jack could even form a coherent question, Langston flipped his bow over. With the bow tips clattering along the stones and his feet running backward along the far wall, he dropped rapidly down the shaft. Langston! Clenching his teeth, Jack flipped his bow over as well. If Langston was going to die, he wasn't going to die alone. But even as he started to slide down the shaft, a pair of Kadaf forelegs folded themselves off his arms to catch firmly against the side walls. No! Dracos' thought whispered in his mind. We have to help him, Jack insisted. He is a true warrior, Jack, Dracos said, his tone firm yet somehow gentle. He has made the decision to sacrifice himself for us and for the Kada enchanting people who stand at risk. Our job now is to make certain his gift was not in vain. Tears flooded into Jack's eyes, tears of guilt and anger and hopelessness. Dracos was right, of course, but that didn't make it any easier. Come, Dracos said, shifting his grip on the side walls. I will help you. That's all right, Jack said, turning his bow back right side up again. I can do it. Shaking away the tears, his eyes burning with the sounds of destruction still going on around him, he resumed his climb. The first group of Brumgas never had a chance. There were 3 of them, and before their pea-sized brains could register what was happening, Tanim had leaped like a gray fury into their midst. The attack was probably nowhere near the level of Dracos' own warrior's skill, but in the white-hot fury of Tanim's righteous anger, skill and training didn't seem to matter that much. Even as Allison broke out of her paralysis and ran to her aid, the Kada's claws and tail and jaws lashed out, sending Brumgas reeling backwards or lying them flat out on the ground. In bare seconds, it was all over. Tanim shook herself once as she stood over her defeated enemies, then found the next group with her eyes and again charged. But this time it would be different, Allison knew with a sinking heart. Tanim's first attack had succeeded largely through the element of surprise. But that surprise was gone now. The rest of the battle line had been alerted, and Allison could see shadowy Brumgan forms turning as they recognized the new threat coming in along their flank. The nearest enemy firing position was over 50 yards away over open ground. Long before Tanim reached it, Allison knew, the combined laser fire would cut her to smoking ribbons. Unless the Kada had help. Tanim was perhaps halfway to her next target when Allison reached the remains of her first. So far, none of the Brumgas had opened fire, but any second now that would change. Ignoring the scattered bodies, Allison scooped up one of the laser rifles and snapped it up to her shoulder. And stopped, her mouth dropping open in astonishment. The Brumgas were running. All of them, along the entire line, were abandoning their weapons and their posts and lumbering south toward the main house as fast as their tree trunk legs would carry them. What in blazes? Allison looked toward the hedge, wondering if the slaves had brought up some unexpected and impossible superweapon. But the ones still on their feet were clearly unarmed, and the ones on the ground were only now warily starting to get up again. She looked south, wondering if some silent retreat order had been given. But there was no one there, and no indication of any reason for such an order. There was nothing, in fact. Nothing but Tanim. And then, finally, Allison understood. The Brumgas remembered Dracos' last visit here all right, and they'd certainly learned from that experience. But they hadn't learned how to fight a Kada poet warrior. They'd learned to run from him. Allison filled her lungs. Don't kill them! She shouted to Tanim as she again started after the Kada. Surrendering and fleeing enemies, she knew, were always to be rewarded with their lives. It encouraged others to do the same. She needn't have worried. Tanim passed the first running group of Brumgas without a glance, continuing on toward the next. Like a good hunting dog, the Kada was making sure to flush all the birds from their nests. And then, from one of the groups of bushes, a lone figure stepped out of concealment. A human figure, Allison saw, with a shoulder-slung laser rifle at the ready. Come on, dragon, he shouted, turning the rifle toward Tanim. Come and get me! It was Gazin. Allison caught her breath, but Tanim didn't even flinch. Breaking from her straight-on charge, she turned sharply south, heading in a big circle across Gazin's line of fire. "Come on, dragon!" Gazin shouted again as he swiveled to keep facing her. He fired twice, his shot scorching the air in front of and behind the running Kada. "Come and face me like a warrior!" Allison braked to a halt and dropped to one knee, bringing her borrowed laser to her shoulder. With Gazin's silhouette partially obscured by the bushes beside him, she knew this would be a very tricky shot, and she would get only one. As soon as that laser light flashed, he would turn his own weapon on her, and unlike Gazin, Allison had no cover nearby to protect her. But Tanim couldn't circle forever. Sooner or later, Gazin would get tired of trying to taunt her into a direct attack, and he would kill her. Clenching her teeth, Allison held her breath and squinted down the barrel at Gazin's profile, and snapped the weapon up and off target as a handful of racing figures abruptly appeared from her left and slammed into Gazin's back. His laser fired once, blasting into the ground in front of him before he disappeared beneath a mass of bodies. Stronlow's rebels had arrived. By the time Allison reached them, it was all over.
"I heard you say not to kill them,"
Stronlow said, his voice grim as he panted for air.
"But this one was special."
"I agree," Allison said, looking down at the body that lay motionless on the grass. She was just as glad that the lack of light hid the details. "As far as I'm concerned, you're welcome to him."
"Thanks to you and the dragon,"
Stronlow said. Tanim came up to them.
Is he stopped?
She asked. "Permanently," Allison said. "Nice move, by the way. Did you actually see Stronlow coming up behind him, or were you just hoping?"
Of course I saw them,
Tanim said, flipping her tail.
A Kada warrior strives always to do what is right, but that doesn't mean a Kada warrior is stupid.
Allison nodded. "I'll remember that."
"What do we do now?"
Stronlow asked. "We wait." Half turning, Allison gestured toward the wall behind them. Toward the wall and the lights of the half-dozen Jin 90 fighters hovering just beyond its built-in defenses. "The Malison Ring strike force has arrived," she said. "Let's sit back and see what happens." By the time Jack reached the top of the pillar, the sounds of crashing stone and shattered guy wires had ceased. The angled skylight opening was covered with a clear dome to keep out the rain, but Dracos's claws made quick work of the fasteners. A minute later, Jack eased his way to the edge of the pillar and looked down. To a horrifying sight. In a dozen places, the cropland had been littered by the rubble from the destroyed stone arches. The 3 Jin 90 starfighters were moving slowly along through the air, their lasers blasting methodically away at the ground ahead of them. Golvans were everywhere, running toward the edges of the canyon like panicked ants. There were bodies, too, at least 20 of them that Jack could see, either beneath sections of the crushed stone or lying in patches of burning crops. And at the focus of the starfighters' attack was Langston. He was sprinting across the ground, zigzagging between strands of plants and leaping over the irrigation canals, dodging the laser blasts as Frost's men herded him toward the nearest canyon wall. Behind the Jin 90s, a much larger deep space transport was drifting along, watching the scene like an approving mother wolf. Jack shivered. "They're going to kill him," he said, the words twisting in his stomach. "As soon as they find out he's not me, they'll kill him."
"Then let us make sure his sacrifice is not in vain,"
Draco said from his shoulder.
"There, across that bridge."
With an effort, Jack lifted his eyes from the carnage below. His pillar was attached to the next by a stone arch, with another arch leading to the next pillar in line. Beyond that, a set of intact guy wires led the rest of the way to the edge of the canyon. It would be a tricky climb, tricky and dangerous both, especially with his muscle fatigue and Dracos' injuries. But Dracos was right. It had to be done. Setting his foot on the arch, Jack looked over toward his goal, the distant bulge of the sand that hid Langston's wrecked starfighter. He paused, frowning. There wasn't just one bulge there, he saw now. There were 2, one much larger than the other. He was still staring in confusion when the larger bulge stirred, the sand seeming to melt away from it. And with a sudden gunning of the lifters, the SNA shot over the canyon rim straight toward him. The ship was hovering above Jack's pillar, its hatch open before the transport and starfighters below seemed to catch on to the fact that their quarry was slipping from their grasp. But by then it was too late. The pillar itself blocked most of their frantic laser fire, and the gap they'd cut for themselves in the aerial obstacles was clear down at the other end of the canyon. 5 minutes later, with the Jin 90s still trying desperately to close the gap, Jack keyed in the star drive. 8 men in Malison Ring uniforms were standing guard at the main gate as Allison led her party across the nearly trimmed lawn towards them.
That's close enough,
the sergeant in charge warned, taking a step toward her. His shoulder-slung machine gun, she noted, wasn't quite pointed in her direction.
What do you want?
I have a group of slaves here, Allison said, taking another step and then likewise stopping. Behind her, she sensed Stronlow and the others doing the same. All they want is to leave. The sergeant shook his head.
Sorry, the Patrichukuk was kind enough to open his gates and his estate for us. I don't think letting his slaves walk out the front door would be a proper way to repay his courtesy.
Was it courtesy or was it bowing to the inevitable? Allison countered. I saw the force you brought with you. You could have knocked your own hole in this wall if you'd had to. In the light from the driveway marker, she saw his eyes narrow.
You're not a slave, he said. Who are you?
My name's Allison Kana, Allison told him. I'm sort of a negotiator.
For slaves?
Allison shrugged. Slaves need someone to speak for them as much as anyone else, probably more so.
Probably,
the sergeant conceded, his eyes flicking to the mixed group of aliens standing silently behind her.
Sorry, Kana, but my orders are to keep the place bottled up until the Major finishes his search. That means nobody leaves.
But these aren't nobody, Allison reminded him. By Brumadum law, they're property. Behind the sergeant, one of his men stirred. The other mercenaries didn't look all that comfortable either.
Yeah, I know,
the sergeant said, his voice darkening with contempt.
But we didn't come here to free a bunch of slaves.
You're not here to keep them in either, Allison countered. Or did the Patrichukuk hire you to do that?
Hardly, the sergeant said sourly. In fact, he may be looking down the barrel of some real trouble right now, depending on what the Major finds.
Then you don't owe him anything, right? The sergeant's face pinched uncertainly.
Well,
Sergeant, the soldier who had reacted called. Do we need to keep this gate closed? It's feeling kind of stuffy over here. For a long minute, the sergeant studied Allison's face. Then his lip quirked.
Go ahead and open it,
he ordered.
The gate squad might object, one of the other mercenaries warned. Make sure they don't, the sergeant said flatly. Janus formation. We don't want anyone sneaking in behind us.
He motioned Allison forward.
You wouldn't mind marching your livestock past my men, would you? He asked. Just to make sure the guy we're looking for isn't tucked away in the crowd.
No problem, Allison assured him, gesturing in turn to Stronlow. The Etra lined up his people and led them toward the waiting soldiers. Shufti Lee, the house slave, was the last in line. His face was rippling with Wistwak emotion, his eyes already gleaming dreamily with the glow of freedom. Allison waited until they had all cleared the gate before stepping forward herself. Thank you, she said quietly.
Like you said, they're property, the sergeant reminded her. You have someplace to take them?
Allison nodded. I understand the Daughters of Harriet Tubman have a station nearby. The sergeant nodded back.
Good luck.
And a minute later, for the first time in nearly a month, Allison found herself breathing free air again. She'd almost forgotten how good that felt. Stronlow was standing nearby, waiting silently with his newly freed compatriots. Well, come on, Allison said briskly, heading down the entry drive toward the public street in the city beyond. Your future's waiting.